Hello, and welcome to a new episode of World Talks, Dialogues and Insights from Southeast Asia, curated by the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung. I'm Francie, your host, and in this video series, we bring together voices and perspectives from across the Southeast Asian region, those who are working toward a more sustainable, just, and inclusive future. We explore ideas that connect people and the Southeast Asia region, from climate resilience to green innovation, from ecological wisdom to sustainability, from gender equity to democracy and human rights. Each conversation is an invitation to reflect on where we are, what is changing, and how we can move forward together. In this episode, I'm talking to Dr. Khoo Ying Hooi, Associate Professor of International Relations and Human Rights at the Department of International and Strategic Studies, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Universiti Malaya, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, about her recent paper, Who's Indo-Pacific? Civil Society Perspectives from Southeast Asia and Strategic Recommendations for EU and German Human Rights Engagement. Hi, Dr. Khoo Ying Hooi.
Hi, Francie.
Can you please introduce yourself, your position, your background, and I'm really interested to know and to hear what first motivated you to work on regional topics.
Well, my name is Ying Hooi, and as you have introduced me, currently I teach at the Department of International and Strategic Studies, Universiti Malaya here in Kuala Lumpur. Basically, about my background, my work focuses on human rights, democracy, civil society, and increasingly now I look at the geopolitics around the Southeast Asia, which explain how I got into this current topic. So over the years, I've also been involved with the different regional networks, interviews with different activists and also practitioners. And these works have provided me the opportunity to actually brings me very close to the communities of across the regions, from Timor-Leste to Malaysia to Indonesia and so forth. And all this experience makes me wonder where people often assume that academics only become interested in certain topics because of their own, only based on personal interest. But I think on this particular topic, some academics are interested in geopolitics, but there's an assumption that because they actually love the topics on strategy, big power politics, or grand theories. But I have a little bit of a different interpretation in that, whereby I think I started with peoples, the activists, the students, the community organizers that I earlier mentioned. So those who really operate at the edge of the political space that we see, especially in the Southeast Asia region. So when you spend enough time with these groups, then you begin to realize that actually their struggle and their fight don't happen just in isolation. And it is not just about the internal politics itself, but they are shaped by the forces far bigger or far beyond than our national conversations. So this is why I start to get into the topics of geopolitics here, although almost reluctantly, because being trained in IR, and also focus on human rights, there is a debate of the different notions of interpretations coming from the tool itself. But I think these bigger strategic dynamics that I see across the regions, for instance, influence of China, influence of the US, and many others, powers started kind of entering my research, not because I wanted to just study about great power competition, but because the civil society, the experience with the civil society kept pointing me that there is a close relationship between the two, and understanding the geopolitics really makes it very important for me to shape how these narratives can actually trickle down and reshape the everyday civic life, and also more importantly, understanding how people are adapting to such a situation.
Were you also in the civil society beside in the academia?
Yes, well, before I joined the university, of course, my background is mainly working on human rights. But at the same time, I also believe that it is important, especially for scholars or researchers, to also contribute back to the societies. And working on human rights, I think you cannot dismiss that role of being very close to the civil societies at the same time and believing it that what are the ways to actually promote and advocate for human rights in the everyday life as well.
In your paper, your recent paper entitled Whose Indo-Pacific Civil Society Perspectives from Southeast Asia and Strategic Recommendation for EU and German Human Rights Engagement, what is understood of the term Indo-Pacific? How, why, and by whom was the concept created? And who defines the term in which way? Could you share a bit more about this?
I came quite a long way in thinking of I should really do topics on Indo-Pacific framework and link it with the civil society, especially looking at the Southeast Asia. And of course, before I derive into this paper, I have had several conversations with different stakeholders, including the scholars and the practitioners as well. So there was always these connotations that when people talk about Indo-Pacific, people right away thinking that, Indo-Pacific is one of the terms that sound very strategic, and it very much owned by the different major powers. And in today's world, of course, it always point out to powers such as US and also the Quad, where consists of Japan, Australia, India, and so forth. But I think the concept itself actually holds a lot of ambiguity. And at its core, yes, I cannot deny it's a geographic kind of term, because in this part of the world, we are more familiar with the term Asia Pacific, but not Indo-Pacific. Yeah, but increasingly, I guess we see Indo-Pacific being raised in everyday life as well, not only by the state leaders, but also among the circle of the civil society, just that very little attention was being paid on that. But politically, from that lens itself, it's a narrative that I see crafted largely by the governments, by the different governments, and also geopolitical actors. And it is never, and it is not a word that basically emerged from the people or communities. And it is not a term coming from the ground up. Yeah. So historically, of course, we read the literatures, we see that this term was being raised long time ago, actually. Started from countries like Japan and then the US, and they started using it to actually describe the maritime connectivities and also to balance the China's growing influence. In some of the European documents on Indo-Pacific strategy, it was specifically mentions about that in several clauses. Then, of course, several countries such as Australia adopted it, and India is a huge proponents of Indo-Pacific framework. And hence, I think each actor that we see here emphasizes slightly different things. And what's very interesting is to come back to our own region, ASEAN. In fact, this year as Malaysia as the ASEAN chair, we just have had ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific Forum just over the weekend, which I also attended. And the connotations of the Indo-Pacific of ASEAN very much stand out compared to the definitions by the US, Japan, India, or the European countries. Yeah, the ASEAN interestingly tries to actually neutralize it through the AOIP, ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, not rejecting the term, because the first AOIP forum started in Indonesia during the Jokowi's time. There was a first forum. And hence, I think ASEAN do not want to reject the term, but not fully owning it either. But I can see slowly they're trying to actually put up their own narratives that this is a term that should be inclusive. And hence, it's very interesting to see how then the civil society will view these terms differently. So, because in my interviews, many of the activists were some they kind of heard of it, but some were also puzzled, and some basically think it is never an issue when I asked about Indo-Pacific. But some said, clearly say that that is not our language, while others say they only hear it from the donors sometimes, and also some of the academic related kind of conferences. So I guess there is a certain level of discomfort coming on by the civil society, because in some countries it can also carry some political risk as well. Hence, I think using the Indo-Pacific language here can be interpreted as aligning with the Western narratives, or taking side in today's world where we see the US-China rivalry. And we also see the civil societies, organizations in this part of the world, the region especially, being famously always being labeled as a foreign agents. And hence, I think this term has to be used very much cautiously. And I think in my paper, I treat the Indo-Pacific terminology not as an objective description of the region, but as a political story, basically. How a story that's being told mostly by the states, and the moment when this powerful geopolitical story entered the region, it inevitably basically affect those who did not write it, or who did not really want to get themselves into it. But I think civil society had to adjust to the narrative that they did not choose. And this is where we see the crossroad of the civil society in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I remember in the past, when I studied also, we only heard the term Asia Pacific most of the time. And it was coined by one of the great powers at the time, right? It was Cold War. And I think if we go not in the academia or civil society, common people, day-to-day people, they have no idea perhaps what is Indo-Pacific. In your paper also, you kind of implied that this term, this concept, Indo-Pacific, is a very state-centered strategic construct, yeah, supported by big powers in our world. The civil society actors, you mentioned earlier that some people they reject, some people they said that it doesn't matter to them. It's the language of donor, the language of something that not really related with what's happening on the field, according to them. Is there any influence on the ground shaping the life of communities and the civil society activists in Southeast Asia today?
Geopolitics does impact on the civil society, whether you want to acknowledge it or you do not want to really acknowledge it. And I think, yes, absolutely, it does impact on them. And this is one of the most, I would say, misunderstood realities. That is something that I think it is not a topic that people really want to open up and discuss about it, because it also related to the countries that you are in as well. And especially in this region, it can open up to a lot of risks. When we talk about the relationship with the different countries or criticize another countries that can have a major interest in your own countries or regions. And by having said that, I think on the surface, while the Indo-Pacific always seems to be a rather distant kind of foreign policy term, but when you talk to the civil societies, from the interview itself, initially it doesn't seem to be that matter. But slowly, when you probe a little bit more, then you realize that the impact is very real and very immediate, because there are sometimes the topics that the civil society will have to avoid as well, due to many other considerations. And I think the first way they feel, especially now, is through the funding volatility that we talk about. And civil society in Southeast Asia has always been donor dependent. And while we realize that, but no one really want to really open up this discussion and talk about it. How do we move forward by being less dependent on the donors, especially when it comes to American and European sources right now. So the moments when the Indo-Pacific becomes a framework for foreign policy, the donor money somehow shifts with it as well. Although it is more significant in the academic world in a way, But I think slowly we also see that increasingly that the Indo-Pacific frameworks are being used even more now. So under Trump 2.0, this is where suddenly everybody was talking about, the funding volatility, whereby the US restructure is foreign aid. But at the same time, we also come to realize actually what US has done later with the Trump 2.0 was not even new. It has been happening, but just that it has not been sufficient attention towards it. And so now that we also see with the global crisis such as the Ukraine, Gaza crisis, and somehow there was the internal budgets by the different donors that moving towards the different directions and slowly impact on the priorities of the donors that the Southeast Asian civil societies are facing right now. And of course, the second impact that I see is the political suspicion and the danger as well. In some of the countries that have very strong relations with certain major powers, this can actually impose a higher danger into the advocacy of that particular NGOs. So for instance, in several countries, adopting or appearing to adopt the term Indo-Pacific framing can be interpreting as taking side. And this is where I highlighted just now about the AOIP, which is a very interesting construct by the ASEAN itself, that wanting to have all sides to talk about Indo-Pacific framework, and this will be something that we are yet to see how is it going to move forward. But of course, with the political suspicion and the danger that we see in the countries such as the Philippines, this fits directly into the notions of the red tagging that is so popularly being talked about and increasing risk. And also in Malaysia, for instance, the civil society become more cautious about how it engage internationally, because geopolitics is sensitive and it can sometimes be very much easily politicized as well. And of course, the third impact that I see is on communities really affected by the big infrastructures project, which I also include in my paper, where when we look at Indo-Pacific itself, it's marked by the race for connectivity. Connectivity is so important nowadays. Hence, this project will involve certain form of different investments coming to the regions. And of course, there's also environmental impacts and risks here that we see as well, that they can be working in increasingly dangerous conditions or being criminalized just for opposing certain development projects. So yes, I think Indo-Pacific can be seen rather abstract at the top, and not necessarily that, just to use the term Indo-Pacific, but broadly, I think what we see is really how the geopoliticals actually impact on the work of the civil societies here. And hence, I think this sort of narratives can further delegitimize the civil societies overnight, and hence this will be the time that really look into the geopolitical narratives in these regions and how to move forward.
You just mentioned about this, how the civil society, the spaces, the civic spaces across Southeast Asia, you can name the countries. The government, they increasingly use a securitization strategy. They use the laws and surveillance to limit civic spaces. Could you maybe name 2 or 3 of the most visible consequences of this securitization for the civic actors, and how they adapt to survive this environment? Because it will be really difficult. Funding is cut, and then also, the local government, the state also start to close the civic spaces.
Well, ironically, if you are trained in IR, securitization is one of the key theoretical framework that we are always trained. Securitization is so important. But of course, focusing on human rights works makes the interpretations or the usage of securitizations more problematic and complex. And I also get requests from the NGOs that, the governments now and then always use the reason for, we need to securitize the space just to protect the people as one of the justification for certain legislations. And they were also finding out, the civil society were finding out, how do we counter such a framing narrative that can actually eventually impact on the communities, and not by protecting them by using such a narrow kind of notions of securitizations. And I think this was one of the strongest findings in the paper, where securitizations, as we see, is a tendency to of the governments, the different governments, to frame activisms can be a form of threat here. And whether it is national security language, sometimes they will use a justification, it is national securities, or maybe even counter-terrorism language as well, or public order rhetoric. But the impacts all here is very much the same. That is the shrinking of the civic space that we see. And I think one of the most visible consequences of securitization that we can see is, of course, criminalization across the regions. So activists are charged under different laws, such as sedition law, anti-terror laws, or cybersecurity laws that are becoming very popular nowadays, even when their work has nothing to do really with the government's interpretation of securities. So, for instance, in Malaysia, we also see the subtle but the persistent restrictions on the freedom of assembly and also expressions, for instance. And I think the second consequences I can see is surveillance. And in today's world, with AI technologies, I think surveillance have become more creative and innovative. And this includes not only physical surveillance now, but the online surveillance that becomes so difficult to actually manage. And I think the troll armies that target on the different groups such as LGBTs, the women human rights defenders, are becoming quite increasingly concerning. And some respondents also say they no longer feel as safe even for attending certain programs, because they can be under severe surveillance as well. And I guess my last is the third is the delegitimizations of the work of the civil societies. Coming from this interpretation is that governments also often portray NGO as foreign funded agents, basically to disrupt the government's mechanisms. And this kind of narrative can delegitimize the advocacies and sometimes turn the communities against them as well. And yet, following your second questions about how the civil society can adapt to it, or how are they adapting to it right now. And I guess I can see several new strategies, and this was informed to me through the interviews as well. Some, they shift their advocacy's language to appear less threatening and to be more aligned with the public sentiment. So they are being more careful with the language nowadays. And some also diversify the funding even before these huge discussions about the funding volatility. And I think they diversify funding through crowdfunding, or some even move into social enterprises as well in a more creative way, while still trying to do the same thing. And I think one of the prominent features is many of the civil society build the cross-border alliances for solidarity and safety. While this is not new, but I think increasingly we see it is becoming even more and stronger as well. And I think this adaptation, some of it can be quite creative, but I guess some people do not like the word resilience, civil society resilience, but I guess it is not just about resilience, but it is also about survival of the civil society in this rather troubling time, yet finding ways to engage into the different creative adaptations. But I still believe the cross-border alliances are very, very important in this.
In your paper, you cover many countries. You had interview with many civil society actors, right? I would like to know from your discussion, we had a discussion already just now about new geopolitical terms, how it impacts the civil society, and also how the governments in the region label them, limit civic spaces. Beside this problem, from your discussion, what are other major issues that the civil society in Southeast Asia face with?
I would say in the broader dimensions, the civil society groups in Southeast Asia is experiencing transitions in a way. That you have the veteran activists, but at the same time you have those who just joined as well. But sometimes they might share different ideologies and different thinking in how the things should be moving forward. And you will see the young people nowadays have a lesser strict ideologies, but rather they are looking for the more alternative ways. And many of them also do not agree with engaging with the established political institutions, right? Because they are facing democratic fatigue. They do not believe that the political institutions can provide them solutions. Hence, we see the global trend of the students' activism and the students' protests across the regions, and mainly basically led by the students themselves. So it is a very interesting trend to see. This is basically the internal struggle of the civil societies themselves. How do they reform their groups to actually take in the new ideas and to bridge this generational gap that is very real that we see nowadays. But of course, moving back to my research paper, I think some of the challenges that I have earlier mentioned as well, I think funding is always the top concern, because that is basically how the civil societies in the region survive. And second is about delegitimizations that I also discussed earlier. But I think they are fighting with the risings of the more right-wing politics and also populist politics across the regions as well. And this is not just about the Southeast Asian politics, but it is a global trend that they are seeing. Hence, it makes their work very difficult in order to gain a legit kind of platform to actually champion the ideals of democracy and human rights, where it is increasingly being crushed. So that is something that hence they are looking into the different forms of advocacy as I see. But of course, another challenge that is can be seen is the thematic distortion due to the donor trends. So sometimes this is very interesting as I see. So many activists said sometimes the donor priorities pull them away from the actual community needs. Not all, but some. So if the donors want certain topics, and they might need to move forward that certain dimensions to make that work, just to get the funding as well. So I guess this pressure ironically also weakens the authenicities of the civil societies. Hence, but this also provides a long-term impact on the civil society world, especially for those working on human rights. That the young people see, why civil society behave in such a way that, it is not an industry that I wanted to get in. It is not professional enough, and there was some, misunderstood among the different generations because of the different ideologies that I see. So I guess in short, what I can see is that the civil society is being squeezed from multiple sides, not only political from this geopolitical lens that we see, but also financial. And the narrative, I think the narrative's impacts is something that is very difficult to actually move away. And not only that, then we also see the digital as well. So it's a combination of a different risks. This is precisely why earlier I mentioned the cross-border alliances becoming even more important now, because the issues that they face in their own national boundaries is no longer isolate, but it can actually resonate with many other different countries, especially in this region.
Dr. Ying Hooi, I don't want you to give out too much, because the audience definitely need and must read your paper. This is a very good paper. But can you share a bit? You line out very well in your paper, very clear recommendation on this topic, right? Indo-Pacific, civil society, and strategic recommendation for international actor and in human rights engagement. Maybe share us some recommendation for short, mid, and long term? Because I agree with you that civil society work is not short term, could be decades, yeah, could be 20 years, 30 years, because the complexity of the issues in our region and different country, different actor, different regimes. So could you please share some of your top recommendation for the short, mid, and long-term perspective?
I think the immediate one, the first I would say the need to create a flexible emergency fund for the NGOs that are being at risk. And this is also something that, when we talk about civil society, it is not just about NGO itself, but it also includes the universities. And I think I mentioned briefly about the importance of the university network as well in the paper. So I think right now, one of the biggest dangers is the organizational collapse with the political developments that we see in the regions, and also not only internally but also externally. And the second thing is also something related in the short term, that is strengthen the protections for the defenders. So the protections must go beyond evacuations. We shouldn't expect the human rights defenders should flee the country when there is a risk that happens, and rather it should also include legal representations, psychosocial support, and digital security, for instance. And I think these two are very important for the short terms. As in moving to the medium terms, I think provide the funders to provide multi-year core funding is important. Some fundings are way too short for the civil society to actually carry out meaningful campaigns or projects. And I think this is the single most transformative step that, let the civil societies to decide their priorities, and by giving them the core funds, actually give them a breathing space to think of the long term rather than constantly chasing the project grants itself. So, and the midterm, the second recommendation will be continue to reinforce the regional networks. There has been work being done, of course, but as I earlier mentioned, I think several times, the regional alliances are very important, as I see, because they give the local actors the safety, visibility, and also solidarities coming from the regions. We do not want to see the Myanmar activists continue to flee the countries where they have to go to beyond the regions because our region is not safe for them. So I think supporting this network shape can help ensure that even in the restrictive context, the activists are never isolated. And comes to the long term, and I think very important is to build a more permanent or comprehensive civic infrastructure. This is where earlier on I said to invest in institutions that, when we talk about civil society, we are not just talking about NGOs itself, but we are looking at these human rights ecosystems, whereby there's human rights centers, that independent media hubs, activist training, academies, regional knowledge platforms. So all these are important to create continuity and preserve memory as well. And I think this is something that we still do not really have. Rather, it is very difficult to actually gain the platforms that consist of everything to see what the past civil societies have done and what we can really learn from that. And my last but not least is, of course, to support this, what I call in the paper, the narratives, the Indo-Pacific narratives, narrative sovereignty, to give the sovereignty to how the civil societies interpret Indo-Pacific and the geopolitics as well, and let them build their own narratives framework. And I think I put the term Asian-owned democracies. That can be, of course, if you just read Asian-owned democracy, it can be misinterpreted. But I would really like to emphasize here that the framing does not imply the civil society is advocating for a different or alternative model of democracy. But rather, I think what they are emphasizing is a way of challenging now, as we see how the constant or regular portrayal of democracy as a Western export. Although it is a very old kind of a narrative, but it continues until today. And they always question why then. And hence, the Asian-owned democracy is basically emphasizing that the basic democratic values, such as participation and so forth, have long-standing local roots and histories in Asia. So that is basically an interpretation to bridge the two, that we should not continue to divide the West and the Asia as black and white. And I think in this sense, it refers to reclaiming the narrative, but not redefining the underlying principles of democracy, but it should be the same on that sense. So, but of course, I think nowadays, as we see, the respondents, the civil society groups in my interview also noted that some were actually had to resort into the closings of the offices and things like that due to the donor relocations. So hence, I think the building of these different narratives frameworks in the long term is really important to sustain the civil society's activism in this region.
Thank you. We also have our audience in Germany and in the EU, in European Union. Do you have any particular recommendation to the government of Germany and also to the European Union?
Well, of course, I know when we keep talking about the civil societies in the regions, should also advocate that the European donor should act in terms of helping the civil society. I think that narrative should be changed. It's not about helping, but it's rather a mutual learning space, because we also see how the right-wing politics are also happening in the European regions as well. And I guess the two regions have a lot of things to learn from each other, and to break through it is to see how the civil societies can actually work together and bridge the two different histories that we share, and how do we move forward and continue to have our own to emphasize on the underlying principles of democracy that has always been there. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Khoo Ying Hooi, for speaking to us today and for sharing your valuable insight with our listeners. Stay tuned for the next episode of Bull Talks, Dialogues and Insights from Southeast Asia, where we continue exploring the ideas, people, and stories driving change across Southeast Asia.